So half of the time it's more a political sort of marketing campaign than what it is actually doing the job. And you constantly have to take the sort of organization on that journey and showing them some nuggets of value.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process.
Welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers, and today I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Pieter Hefer. Now, Pieter is a business process management specialist working in the financial services space. And like all of our episodes, I have the privilege of sitting down with different individuals in different organizations, different industries. And it is so fascinating to get these different perspectives, understand what's working for them, what's not working for them. For those that are listening, you'll be able to, have a think about, well, what's my context? What organization am I currently in? Do we have a high process maturity level? Do we have a low process maturity level? What pieces of information can I take on board and start to have conversations in my organization, and maybe what isn't relevant to us in what we're going through right now. So absolutely excited for this conversation with you, Pieter. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniel. I'm really looking forward to the conversation and hopefully contribute to this weird and wonderful world that we live in terms of business process management and what it means for different people in different organizations. So yeah, really privileged for me to be here, and thank you for the opportunity.
That's great. So tell us, when were you first introduced to the topic of business process management? Was it sort of more of a formal training that you did, or did you kind of stumble your way into it?
I think like most of us, I've stumbled upon it. So my formal background is industrial engineering. So always very process driven, but not specific process training. And before I knew it, I found myself working in a manufacturing environment, fresh out of uni and discovering the weird and wonderful world of enterprises. And we were faced with quite an interesting problem where it was an engineered to order manufacturing environment that manufactured military vehicles. And suddenly with everything that was happening with Afghanistan, they received a fairly large order, which the company wasn't really geared to from a production perspective. And then they kind of got a lot of industrial engineers to come and help them, just because their production line was just not optimizing and working and producing the output that it should produce. And I think it's from that moment when I really understood the complexity of enterprises and all the different types of processes that interact with each other. So much so that I actually did my thesis on process through that organization. And it was really fascinating just to see how many different touch points exist through a very simple process. And then as soon as you start putting it on the board, people say, oh, but we didn't know that happens. That's really not what we wanted to happen. So, and it kind of stuck with me that I think there's actually a lot of value in that. And so I kept working in the manufacturing environment for 15 months. And then I stumbled, once again, very fortunate, my way into the insurance industry back in South Africa. And it's just opened up a whole new world of exploration, which is really exciting.
That's awesome. That's great. And I think, that transparency that you're talking about, that, it reveals to the team what's actually going on, what not just what am I doing, what's in front of me, but how is my work impacting those around me, those upstream, those downstream. If we're going to be delivering value as an organization, if we're so focused on our individual areas without understanding the wider impact of what we're doing, it's going to be hard to optimize that sort of the way that we're delivering that value. But so I guess moving into the financial services space, would you say that the way that the organization approached process management, was it similar across the various industries that you've worked in? Is it quite standardized? Is it very similar? Are there different sort of challenges or different opportunities depending on the industry?
Look, it's a very good question. And I think the two industries that I've sort of crossed paths with was inherently very different, where in the engineering world, everything is very engineering, right? So there's drawings and documentation and standards. So there was a natural inclination of having the house a little bit more in order, but still not enough appetite to invest fully in a formal function. So it existed, but also unofficially. Whereas in the financial sector, I think when I stumbled across, there were so many different types of processes. So you see anything from Word to Excel to PowerPoint. There's no uniform way of talking about processes. So it was chalk and cheese, which was really interesting for me, because if you start thinking about the complexities and like you say, how everything moves through the value chain, and if you don't know what the left hand is doing from the right hand, or where the sort of right hand might go for a break somewhere else down the line, it's very hard to understand what is actually happening throughout that process. So for me, it was different in the sense that the one was more official, where the other one was unofficial, but both actually try to achieve the same result, because there is value in understanding where things sort of go through the life cycle of a process.
Yeah, great. And what drives an organization to adopt this process-centric approach from a high level? Obviously, you have an understanding, or a good understanding, of why the value that it can bring to an organization. But I guess from that senior leader's sort of perspective, they're looking at their strategic objectives and what they're trying to achieve. How does BPM support that, and what drives a senior leader to want to adopt this approach for their organization?
Yeah, once again, I think I've experienced both spectrums, where the one is it's just about improvement. So therefore, if you want to improve something, then hopefully you can have workshops and you'll have whiteboards and you'll document to get an understanding of where can we improve. But that is driven from improvement. So it's not a business process architecture where you've got everything documented and you've got the different touch points. So it's purely driven from improvement, which is also, I think, a lot easier to get across the line, because if you want to ask for an investment, they'll say, okay, but if you can save $50,000 or $500,000, then they won't mind sponsoring a program of $250,000 or whatever the case might be. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum is kind of the chicken and the egg scenario, where you can't really improve your process if you don't understand your processes. And the more complicated your processes become, then you need to have them documented, integrated, understanding the different touch points that they might have. And especially now, the financial sector, I think a lot of users or people that will view this episode, if they find themselves in the Australian market in the finance sector, will agree that so many things have changed over the last couple of months, and it's more important than ever to understand the dependencies across different components of the process. So it's not just about the process. If you change a process on one step, it might impact a risk or a control or a new regulation or legislation that's come about. So it's about understanding, not just improving the process, but understanding that, hey, if we change the process, are we actually considering all the things that we should consider? Because I also think in the modern world, businesses have become a lot more complicated in the sense, or not complicated, more complex in the sense of technology has advanced. People are starting to move away from legacy systems to more modern systems. So suddenly you sit with an ecosystem of between 5 and 10 different systems, all trying to talk and work together, but it's driven by one process. Right. So if you don't have that visibility of all the different dependencies, then the chance of you breaking something by just improving a process becomes almost inevitable. And I think my experience is, and sorry, I might go a little bit backwards and forwards here, but it's kind of like small businesses start up, and it's not as important because as the business is not that big, so it's not really critical. There's not a lot of people in the organization to remember stuff is a lot easier. Then fast forward 10 years, suddenly the business has grown, everything is complicated, there's more systems, you see a lot more people in the office, in and around you, And suddenly it's become a lot more complex. But if you haven't had that discipline from the start, now suddenly you sit with this massive task. And I think that's the difficult part from an executive buy-in at the moment is it's almost like an administrative exercise to get everything up to scratch, just to understand the as is. Now, and I think it's also important to recognize that you're never going to boil the ocean by documenting every single process under the sun, because that's also not valuable. It's understanding what should be done and what should not be done, but then finding the resources and the time to actually get the stuff that should be done. And it takes time. It takes resources from SMEs within the organization. It takes resources that can facilitate it. I think a lot of people will recognize that Visio is probably a great place to start, but once you start getting into a complicated architecture, Visio just simply doesn't have the power that it needs to from an enterprise perspective.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's where, the topic of business process management, it's, as I guess BPM practitioners, we're going to be careful with the language we're using because we could have senior leaders in our organization that have done that whole, 18-month, 2-year exercise of documenting processes, 5, 10, 15 years ago, only to end up with all of this documentation, but no real sort of purpose or reason behind why they did all that activity. And then they look at, when they hear BPM, it's like, oh yeah, we tried that, we did that. Like it didn't deliver value to the organization, but it was because they didn't have a clear understanding of, well, what are we going to do with this documentation once we've got it there.
Yeah, and I can't stress that point enough. I think if you're going to document process for the sake of documenting them and then putting them in a filing cabinet where they gather dust, then you might as well just throw money in the bin, because then it doesn't add value for anybody. You have to have a clear purpose and vision of why you want to document those processes, who the stakeholders are that should have access to those, and what are they going to use it for. And like I mentioned earlier, I think there's two different, in our example at least, there's two complete different stakeholder groups, where the one is a simplified view in the sense of, I just want to follow the bouncing ball, and that's good enough because they want to orientate themselves or where they find themselves in the life cycle of the process. Whereas other stakeholders within the business, they want to understand everything. They want to understand, well, what is this? What are the system rules for this thing? Where's the system rules come from? Does it touch another system? So I think, and that also makes it difficult because now you have one sort of artifact that needs to cater for completely different requirements. And if you don't understand who it is and what they are going to use it for, you're going to end up in that 15 years down the track where, yeah, we've done it and it doesn't really do anything.
Mm-hmm. And where does one start when it comes to, I guess, this BPM journey? You mentioned a couple of different stakeholders there that you're working with, and they've got different appetites or different reasons for wanting this information. For an organization that is quite low in terms of their process maturity level, where do you begin? Because obviously there are many processes in an organization, and even a number of core processes, but how do you know where to best spend your time, effort, and energy? I guess especially when resources are limited and you're not starting off with a huge team.
That is actually a very unfair question, because I think there is no right answer for that. I think it's very relative to the organization that you're in, the maturity of the organization, the pressures that the organization might feel from a cost perspective or a resource capacity. So I guess my sort of one trick pony answer would be just start. Regardless of what you do and how you do it, whether it's right or not wrong, I think especially in the company where it's immature and it's something that's not really been adopted or well known, just starting that conversation and producing some examples is better than nothing. Even if it is in, in Excel or Visio or even a Word document. It's not about the medium that you use, the process. It's getting the topic up in the air and having those discussions. It's taken me a good 8 years of my career to actually get to the point where we are now. And that was between doing my day job and still recognizing that this is important. So I just slowly started using use cases and examples of where I did some improvements and started to document the process, and then having those workshops and showing the value to people. And that's kind of taken me a long time, but now I'm in the organization where it's really been recognized as a function. There's been resources committed to the function, which is really good. And it's not an easy journey, because it is something that almost has to happen from start in an organization where it's not mature. You have to sell the dream. So half of the time it's more a political sort of marketing campaign than what it is actually doing the job. And you constantly have to take the sort of organization on that journey and showing them some nuggets of value along the way. And I think if you can do that, then you'll start building momentum. You get more buy-in from certain sort of execs throughout the organization. So I think in hindsight, the advice that I have from my perspective is don't try and boil the ocean right from the start. Just take small nuggets and start somewhere, and start getting key business stakeholders to understand the value from not only from an improvement perspective, but also from a document management perspective. And I say document management, it's more process management, but getting the organization to understand, just because the process is classified as what it is today, if we start tweaking it, it will not be the same in 6 months, especially in the modern environment that we live in. And if you can get into the discipline of updating that content whenever you make changes, then the rewards going forward is going to be massive, because I think change management is and will always be one of the biggest sort of barriers within an organization. So just having that discipline and that visibility will make things a lot easier. And the reason why I say that is we've had a couple of examples where things go wrong in a process, and then people start asking the question, yeah, but when did we make that decision? When did this process change from this to this? And then it just becomes literally like a throw rocks at each other scenario, because nobody knows, because it's never been documented. But if you have that discipline, then you can say, whether it's regulators or an executive or a manager, why did this happen? It's like, we made the decision on this date at that time, and that's when it changed. So then you can actually see who made those decisions, and was it the right decision? And can you revert back to the previous one, because the results that is driven is just not what you want.
Right. And that obviously makes it very black and white. And, when it's driven by the actual data there, it helps making better decisions moving forward. But you mentioned there about being able to show nuggets of value along the way, along the journey. Do you have a couple of examples or case studies or use cases where, you were able to demonstrate some nuggets of value that did get that buy-in? Because I think that's one thing for our viewers that would be valuable for them, is to understand, well, what do I need to demonstrate? How much value do I need to show? I think some people might be thinking like, we need to show this much, when actually you just need to show small, simple, quick wins along the journey to continue that sort of momentum, to continue getting that buy-in. So, when you were sharing about those nuggets of value, do you have a couple of case studies or examples you can share with us?
Yeah, exactly. So when we started a couple of years back, we specifically in the financial sector, where everything is so much regulated with all the legislation, we had to go through that pain of documenting most and all of our core critical processes. And the one thing that we sort of tried to do from the get-go is just understanding those dependencies. We would have sort of started documenting processes and then say, but there are 2 processes that's exactly the same in different departments, but they've got 3 or different versions of the same process documented. So then you must start making changes to the process, and suddenly you've got different versions floating around in the business. And we said, no, but if we can just have a centralized register of these processes, have a key owner of the process, but then also a secondary sort of user of those processes, then suddenly there's a lot more visibility, there's a lot more control to say, you know what, you can actually just change the process once. You know who's the other stakeholders that actually consume your process that you own. but now you change it and you have that conversations and buy-in and heads up, I suppose, in terms of I'm changing the process. Is everybody okay with it? Everybody agrees. The training goes through to all the departments and everybody's on the same page, as opposed to, wait a minute, when did this change? Why does the system do this? So I think, and that was a small win for us, but it did pique a lot of interest within the organization. It's like, okay, wait a minute. So there's some value here. The other part that we try to understand is not just the dependencies of the different users of the process, but those different touch points. So you have your procedure documents, maybe linking to the processes, etc. So we just started to drive some of those examples. And with some of the regulatory changes coming through, I found like, and it's not unique to the financial sector, it's not unique to our current organization. I think it's a global constraint within organizations is people will start changing a process to say, we need to change this process, whether it's driven from a cost perspective, improvement, or regulatory. But then there's questions in terms of, okay, so who needs to be involved in this? Do we need to tell marketing about this? Does this thing need to go to compliance? Do we need to tell HR about this process? Where's the different touch points? Suddenly, you have 10, 12 different stakeholders in a room having a lot of discussion, trying to figure out, okay, but where does the bouncing ball actually go upstream and downstream, and who should be involved? Whereas if you start having those dependencies, it's literally a case of putting it on the board to say, there's the process, this is what we want to change, so therefore HR, you need to do something, and compliance, you need to do something, as opposed to wasting a lot of people's time within the organization. So that's one thing where we felt there's a lot of value for people getting time back by having the visibility of what is actually executed on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
And I think the last one for us was, and once again, I don't think it's very unique to our organization at the moment, but just having a process documented makes people think, because everybody follows the process and they go through it on their day-to-day lives and everything is rosy. And then suddenly you have a workshop, you map and document the process, you send the process through for approval. It's like, no, wait a minute. This shouldn't happen here. We don't do this. And then it actually brings to light there's either inaccuracies in the process, or people are following the wrong variant, or the process is literally just broken. So now that the process is actually up and visible, people naturally tend to find improvements for that process. And it might never have been the intent, but it really just highlights those pain points. And those are just kind of, it's small examples, but I feel those are the examples that's actually got us a lot of buy-in from the exec team and sponsorship to actually progress this as a function. We haven't gone to the organization to say, we've taken that process and we've delivered 200,000 words of dollars because we've improved it. We are going to try and achieve those sort of value now, but that's not where we needed to start. So I think a lot of the time people think they need to save a lot of money before it gets recognized, but there are a couple of non-tangible, sort of more qualitative wins that you can get on the board, as opposed to sort of just hundreds and thousands of dollars.
Yeah. No, that's great. And obviously those bigger improvements, sometimes if you're trying to bite off more than you can chew, is, you run the risk of the project or the team, the stakeholders running out of steam before you actually realize that full value. So if you're not being able to deliver value consistently along the journey, you run that risk of it falling over, losing interest, senior leaders, their interest and attention going elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think that's also very sort of useful for us, where, a lot of organizations, if they have a BPMM function or a center of excellence, we don't have a lot of resources. So if you are limited with your resources, you can't do all the work because there's just too much work, especially in sort of medium to sort of large enterprises. So for us, it was about how do we educate the business? How do we get them to participate so that we can multiply our capability without us having to necessarily be very hands-on? And I think that in itself has also driven a lot of value to the organization, because for me, that is where you really set up the long-term strategy of business process management, where people have access, they understand the language, and they also have the capability to find improvements on their own going forward. Yes, there will always be sort of the high-end process and process that needs to be improved, and that's where it gets championed through the business process management or Lean Six Sigma function. But at least if you can get the organization to talk and speak the language of BPM and understand the fundamentals, then you're actually starting to deliver value, because it becomes part of everybody's day-to-day thinking, rather than there's a BPM team and they'll do the work for us, don't worry. That's not going to happen.
Yes, yeah. And is it hard to get that buy-in from, we've obviously touched on, I guess, introducing the concept and the idea to senior leaders, but when working with process participants or process performers, those that when you make changes to the process, you're actually changing their day-to-day work. How do you get buy-in from them or ownership from them, so that, you know, you obviously don't want them to be resistant to that change. You don't want to develop new and improved processes only for the process participants to not be on board with it and to not follow these improvement suggestions or the new process. How do you get that buy-in from these end users?
So maybe I can take that back way to your first question. So how I stumbled across processes and how did it come about? So there I was, a young graduate from university working in a production environment and observing processes and just recognizing that that is not a good way to do things. And telling people that they're doing things the wrong way is not where you're going to get the buy-in, especially in a production environment. You're dealing with trades that is very straightforward, and they'll tell you, just don't bother us, we know what we're doing. So and from that day I really learned that you have to engage the SMEs and the participants in terms of understanding the process. Once again, I think that visibility of whether it's a workshop or whether it's a documented process, but putting it in front of them and making them step through the process, I think naturally people will start recognizing the gaps and the flaws of the process. And then it doesn't come across as condescending in terms of somebody telling you that you're doing the job that you are doing daily wrong. It's, wait a minute, we can actually do this better. And I think once you've made that switch where they come up with the identification of the issues of the process, then that buy-in is automatically. And I think once you've achieved that, they get almost hungry to do more of that. Like, well, I'm capable of doing this, so let's do more of that. And once again, it kind of moves towards that continuous improvement. So it's almost a bit psychological, because I think as BPM specialists, we sometimes can get the tendency of coming in to an area of a process, analyze the process, and just trying to shoot it to pieces and saying, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. Your buy-in from the stakeholders is going to be very hard. Unless you have the conversation with the executives where they say, yeah, we're losing money there, we're losing money there, yeah, fix it. But if you're telling the people that's executing the job, if they haven't raised the pain points, you're entering into a tricky slope.
Right. No, that's interesting. And I guess looking towards the future of this whole space, and I've got a couple of questions around the future, but starting off with over the next 2, 3, 5 years, for those people that are listening to this conversation, where would you be encouraging them where their organization needs to invest their time, effort, and energy when it comes to BPM, especially when they're maybe at more of a lower maturity level? Obviously, we have people listening to this that they're working for organizations where they've been using process mining for a number of years, or robotic process automation. They've got couple of hundred bots sort of going around and doing all sort of work. But for those people that maybe are at a lower process maturity level, what should they be focusing over the next 2, 3, 5 years?
I think once again, it's a very hard sort of question in the sense, but I almost feel it's just get your hands dirty. Start
Yes, right.
somewhere, start networking, start engaging with people that have done it before. I mean, this has been a great find for me in terms of your channel, but also sort of recent resources. I always felt like if you try to do something in isolation, it becomes a lot harder. But if you then start recognizing that it has been done before and it is possible, there's an element of hope and sort of not that sort of sword on your head that this is just destined to fail. It's just too big of a job, so I'm not even going to start. Get your hands dirty. Try and engage and connect with people that's been on the journey. Doesn't matter how far advanced or along the journey they are, just connect with people. That's also one thing that I've learned is different industries have different problems and they have different mechanisms of solving them. And just by engaging with different sort of people and specialists through different industries is valuable in itself. So I would say networking as much as possible. And there's lots of information on the internet. I mean, once we sort of started going down the path of Visio is not cutting it, we need something more succinct and sort of fit for purpose, you start researching and then you stumble across, oh, these consultants, or there's these vendors, or there's this software, or this theory or resources. Then suddenly you realize that you're not a lone ranger in there. There is actually a profession, and there is content, and there is help outside of the organization. And perhaps if it is too daunting, I would almost say, don't be afraid of trying to get additional resources from an external perspective, even if it's just helping you with one or two use cases. Don't have to do all of it at once, because once again, I think that buy-in and support from execs is going to be very hard. So biting them off in smaller chunks is probably a lot better and palatable from a company buy-in perspective.
Yeah, great. And how do you think BPM will change over the next 3, 5, 10 years? Obviously, there's been a lot of technology over the last 5, 10, 15 years, like as I mentioned, process mining and robotic process automation. We've got different ones talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning and how that sort of applies to the space. We've got others that are looking at the whole blockchain space and blockchain as a process. But I guess from your perspective, what sort of trends are you noticing, and what do you think the next 5, 10 years look like, or what's on your radar, or what do you find, what's piqued your interest?
My perception is that I think the technology has been very good for the BPM discipline, in the sense that you can't really introduce RPA or automation if you don't have the process. You have to build the workflow before you can do automation. So it's almost driving that behavior or a requirement for, you need to have the fundamentals before you can move on to the next piece. And I think at the pace of the competition, tough economic environments, and the cost pressures across all industries, I think it's just becoming more and more critical for people to be able to scale and to be able to remove some of that sort of cost pressure, have more improved processes, etc. So I think, in a sense, technology has been very good for this discipline, whereas in the past, if we didn't have RPA, you go to the executive teams like, hey, we need a function for this. Like, why? What's the value? What's the purpose? But now I think there's an objective, and we're starting to play in that space, and that's where it's real tangible value for the organizations. Like, yeah, it's not just a picture. It's actually a picture that comes to life, and we can actually do stuff with that. So I think technology is driving that. That's very good. And the good thing is that technology is not overly complicated. It does challenge the status quo for doing things the conventional way. So from an IT perspective, it does pose a couple of spanners in the works, but that's a complete different conversation for another day. But as soon as you get buy-in from them as well, they understand what the value proposition is, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's been really interesting to see how the technology has caught up and actually promoted this function, and sort of almost creating the need for it. It sort of, you can't ignore it anymore, because you need the one for the other.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, Peter, I just want to thank you for sitting down with me and having this conversation. I've certainly been taking a lot of notes and learning a lot from this conversation and how you're approaching BPM and the various wins that you've had and the challenges that you've overcome. And I think that for our audience, a lot of people will be able to glean from your journey as well. We certainly have a lot of people listening to this podcast from all over the spectrum when it comes to the BPM space. We've got some people that are working in organizations with thousands of employees, and they're an isolated individual that's been tasked to sort of optimize or improve a process somewhere. And then we've got the other end of the spectrum where we've got entire process centers of excellence set up, and the BPM machine is humming along and producing this value. So it was an absolute pleasure to have this chat with you today, and I just want to thank you for sitting down and catching up.
Yeah, once again, thanks, Daniel. I really appreciate it. And by no means is what I've sort of distilled today as the gospel is just what's worked for us. And it's what we needed to do to get it across the line. And I think realistically, if you think about it, it is, to a degree, it is common sense. But you know what they say about common sense is not always so common. But as long as you can start and you can find a way to make it work within your organization and sort of just introduce those value proposition nuggets, then I think it will go a long way. So it's almost like you have to do what you need to do to get it done. And I don't think there's a one answer for the perfect way of doing it. Yes, obviously there might be, but that's a longer journey and discussion to be had. But yeah, I really appreciate you having me on the show. It's been a privilege.